I stood at the pharmacy counter on an otherwise entirely ordinary Thursday afternoon, waiting for my heart medication refill, exactly the way I had every month for years, without incident, when the pharmacist looked up from her computer screen with an expression that told me something was wrong before she said a single word. "Mr. Whitfield, I'm sorry, but your insurance is showing as inactive. This prescription is going to run you $280 out of pocket today if you'd like to proceed without coverage." I stood there, genuinely confused, because as far as I knew, I'd had continuous health insurance coverage through my former employer's retiree plan for the past 9 years, coverage I'd never once had any reason to question or worry about. I asked the pharmacist to double-check, certain there'd been some kind of clerical error. There hadn't been an error. My insurance had been formally canceled 3 weeks earlier, and the person who'd canceled it was my own son-in-law, using access to my accounts I hadn't fully realized I'd given him. I want to tell you exactly what happened over the following month, because discovering how and why my son-in-law had canceled coverage that quite literally kept me alive revealed something about his character and about my daughter's marriage that none of us had fully understood until that pharmacy counter forced the truth into the open. What started as a routine prescription pickup became, within the span of a single conversation with a pharmacist I'd known for years, the beginning of one of the most unsettling months of my adult life. My name is Leonard. I'm 67 years old, and this is the story of the afternoon I discovered my health insurance had been canceled without my knowledge, and the son-in-law whose financial desperation had made him willing to gamble with something considerably more serious than money. If you've ever discovered that someone you trusted had made a decision about your own well-being without ever asking you directly, stay with me until the end, because this story goes somewhere that still unsettles me when I think about how close it came to a genuinely dangerous outcome. And if these kinds of stories matter to you, hit subscribe, because there's more where this came from. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because understanding the full context matters considerably to what eventually happened. I spent 31 years working as a supervisor at a regional distribution center, a stable, unglamorous career that provided, among other things, a genuinely excellent retiree health insurance plan, one of the increasingly rare benefits that made staying with a single employer for 3 decades feel worthwhile, even during the more difficult stretches of that career. My wife, Patricia, and I raised 2 children on that steady income, and by the time I retired at 62, that retiree health plan had become, quite literally, one of the most valuable things I owned, particularly given the heart condition I developed in my late 50s, requiring ongoing medication and regular cardiology monitoring that would have been financially devastating without reliable, comprehensive coverage. Patricia passed 4 years ago. Lung cancer. A difficult final 8 months. That, I want to be honest, made me deeply grateful for exactly the kind of comprehensive insurance coverage that allowed us to focus on her care rather than constantly calculating what we could and couldn't afford. After she died, I continued living alone in the house we'd shared for over 3 decades, managing my own heart condition with the same reliable coverage that had carried us both through Patricia's final illness. I remember, during Patricia's final months, sitting with her in the oncology waiting room on more occasions than I could ever count. And I remember specifically conversations with other patients and families in that same waiting room who were simultaneously fighting their own illnesses and fighting insurance companies over coverage disputes, appeals, denied treatments. Patricia and I never had to have those particular fights, and I've never taken that for granted. understanding clearly how different her final months might have looked without the comprehensive coverage my 3 decades at the distribution center had provided us. It's precisely because I understood so intimately what losing that kind of coverage could actually mean, in the most serious possible terms, that discovering my own coverage had been canceled without my knowledge felt considerably more frightening than a simple administrative inconvenience. I have 2 children. My son, Gary, lives about 6 hours away, and while we maintain a warm relationship, distance naturally limits our day-to-day connection to occasional calls and a handful of visits each year. My daughter, Christine, lives about 25 minutes from me, and she became, particularly after Patricia's death, my primary family connection, visiting regularly, helping me navigate the practical adjustments of living alone after 4 decades of marriage. Christine married her husband, Blake, about 8 years ago. I liked Blake well enough in the early years of their marriage. He was ambitious, worked in what he described as commercial equipment leasing, a business that involved leasing specialized machinery to construction and manufacturing companies. And he had a certain confident energy that Christine clearly found appealing, even if I occasionally found myself wondering whether that confidence was always matched by equally solid underlying judgment. I remember their wedding vividly, a modest but genuinely joyful outdoor ceremony that Patricia, still healthy at the time, had helped plan for the better part of a year. And I remember Blake's toast that evening, promising the room full of family and friends that he would always take care of Christine, that her family was now his family. Words that felt genuine and sincere in that moment, and that I've thought about often since, turning them over against everything that happened years later, trying to understand how genuine sentiment and genuinely troubling judgment could coexist so completely. Within the same person. I want to explain something about how I ended up granting Blake access to my accounts, because this detail matters enormously to understanding how the insurance cancellation was even possible in the first place. About 2 years ago, following a minor cardiac event that required a brief hospitalization, Christine and Blake both became understandably more involved in helping me manage various aspects of my healthcare and finances, at least temporarily, while I recovered. During this period, at Christine's suggestion, I granted Blake what I understood, at the time, to be limited administrative access to my online insurance portal, specifically so he could help me navigate what had become, during my recovery, a genuinely overwhelming amount of paperwork, billing statements, and coverage verification calls that I simply didn't have the energy to manage alone while recovering. I want to be honest that I didn't fully understand, at the time, the full scope of what that access actually granted him. I assumed, reasonably I thought, that this access allowed him to view statements, help me understand billing, perhaps assist with routine administrative tasks. I did not understand, until considerably later, that the specific access level Christine had helped me set up also included the ability to modify coverage elections, add or remove dependents, and, crucially, to voluntarily terminate coverage entirely, a level of access that, in hindsight, went considerably beyond what the situation actually required. I remember the specific afternoon we set up that access, sitting in my hospital room during the final days of that brief hospitalization, Christine on her laptop navigating the insurance portal settings while Blake looked over her shoulder, both of them working together, as far as I could tell, purely out of genuine concern for making my recovery as manageable as possible. I remember feeling at the time a real gratitude for having family willing to take on that particular burden during a frightening medical episode. And I want to be honest that nothing about that afternoon in isolation It's precisely because that moment felt so unambiguously well-intentioned that discovering, 2 years later, how that same access had eventually been used felt like such a profound betrayal of something that had genuinely started from a place of care. Blake's equipment leasing business, I learned only gradually over the following 2 years, had been going through a genuinely difficult stretch. Several major clients had defaulted on lease payments during a broader downturn in regional construction activity, leaving Blake personally liable for equipment financing he'd taken on to fund the business's growth. I want to be fair to Blake in describing this period, because his financial pressure was, as far as I could determine, entirely genuine, rather than any kind of exaggeration or manipulation. He was, by all accounts, facing real and mounting financial difficulty that put considerable strain on both his business and, I later learned, his marriage to Christine. About 4 months before the pharmacy incident, I began noticing small changes in how Blake discussed money during family gatherings. Comments about the overall cost of maintaining multiple insurance policies across the family. Questions about whether my retiree plan's premium contributions could potentially be redirected towards something he vaguely described as more efficient family financial planning. I didn't think much of these comments at the time, assuming they reflected ordinary financial stress, rather than any specific plan targeting my own coverage directly. I remember one specific dinner, about 6 weeks before the pharmacy incident, where Blake brought up the subject more directly than he had before, describing what he called an opportunity involving restructuring several family financial arrangements to be more efficient, language that, in hindsight, sounded suspiciously similar to conversations I'd later learn other families in similar circumstances had described to me after this story eventually became something I shared more openly. I told him, at the time, that I wasn't interested in restructuring anything about my insurance or finances, that my current arrangements had served me reliably for years, and I saw no reason to change them. He nodded, seemed to accept the answer, and the conversation moved on to other topics, though I understand now that this conversation likely represented an early, unsuccessful attempt to gain my explicit consent for something he ultimately decided to simply proceed with unilaterally instead. I want to describe the specific sequence of events that led to my insurance's cancellation, because understanding exactly how it happened matters considerably to the fuller picture of what Blake had actually done. About 3 weeks before that pharmacy visit, Blake had logged into my insurance portal using the access I'd granted him during my recovery 2 years earlier, access that I later learned I had simply never thought to formally revoke once I'd recovered and resumed managing my own affairs independently. Using that access, he'd initiated a formal request to terminate my coverage, representing himself in the online portal's authorization fields as having full authority to make such a request on my behalf. I want to explain what I eventually understood about his specific motivation, because it revealed something considerably more troubling than simple confusion about the scope of his access. Blake, facing mounting personal financial pressure from his failing business, had discovered, through research I later learned he'd conducted rather extensively, that terminating my retiree insurance coverage would trigger a specific clause in an old family insurance arrangement Patricia and I had established decades earlier, a small, mostly forgotten supplemental life insurance policy that included a provision returning a modest cash value if the associated health coverage was voluntarily terminated, rather than simply lapsing through non-payment. The amount involved, I eventually learned, was approximately $11,000, a relatively modest sum in the broader context of everything that followed, but apparently significant enough, given Blake's mounting desperation, to motivate a decision that put my actual physical safety at genuine risk. I want to be clear about what this meant practically. Blake had terminated coverage that provided not just routine healthcare access, but specifically covered my ongoing cardiac medication and monitoring, coverage I depended on continuously given my heart condition, in order to access a relatively modest cash value from an old supplemental policy, apparently believing, based on what he later explained, that he could quietly reinstate the primary coverage before I ever noticed the gap, treating what was actually a serious medical necessity as though it were simply an administrative inconvenience to be temporarily worked around. I want to tell you about that afternoon at the pharmacy counter in a bit more detail, because the specific disorientation of that moment matters to understanding everything that followed. The pharmacist, a woman named Deja who'd filled my prescriptions for years and had developed the kind of familiar, caring relationship pharmacists sometimes build with regular patients, could see my genuine confusion and concern, and she spent several minutes with me, pulling up the specific cancellation record, confirming the exact date it had processed, and gently suggesting I contact the insurance company directly rather than simply assuming some kind of temporary computer error. I remember standing at that counter, other customers waiting behind me in line, feeling a specific mountain panic that I tried, not entirely successfully, to keep from showing on my face. Deja, sensing my distress, despite my efforts to remain composed, actually stepped out from behind the counter for a moment, guiding me to a small seating area near the pharmacy's consultation window, away from the immediate line of waiting customers, giving me a moment to process what I was hearing without the added pressure of feeling watched by strangers. "Mr. Whitfield, I've been filling your prescriptions for almost 6 years now," she said. "This isn't like you to have a coverage lapse. I really think something unusual has happened here, and I want you to get to the bottom of it before you assume the worst about your own situation." I called the insurance company from the pharmacy parking lot, sitting in my car, my hand shaking slightly with a combination of confusion and, as the reality began settling in, genuine fear about what a gap in my cardiac medication coverage might actually mean for my health. The representative confirmed what Deja had already told me. My coverage had been formally terminated 3 weeks earlier, through an online request submitted using credentials associated with my account, along with a specific notation that the requesting party had indicated authority to act on my behalf. I asked, with growing alarm, whether this meant I'd been without any prescription coverage for those 3 weeks, during which time, I realized with a sinking feeling, I'd actually had a routine cardiology follow-up appointment that had, fortunately, simply been billed and processed before the cancellation apparently took effect. A stroke of fortunate timing that, I understood clearly in that moment, could easily have gone very differently had my appointment fallen even a few days later. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Blake once I returned home, because I approached it initially with genuine confusion rather than immediate accusation, still trying to understand how such a thing could have possibly happened without my knowledge. I called Christine first, actually, rather than Blake directly, and I want to describe her reaction because it matters to understanding how thoroughly Blake had kept this decision hidden even from his own wife. Christine was, from what I could tell over the phone, genuinely shocked and confused, having no prior knowledge whatsoever that Blake had taken any action regarding my insurance coverage. "Dad, that doesn't make any sense," she said. "Blake's never mentioned anything about your insurance to me. Are you sure it's not just some kind of processing error on their end?" I explained what the insurance representative had told me, the specific timeline, the notation about authorized access. Christine grew quiet on the phone, and I could hear, in that particular silence, the beginning of her own dawning understanding that something considerably more troubling than a simple administrative error was likely at play. She called me back about an hour later,
her voice tight with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Dad, I need you to come over." I confronted Blake directly, and he admitted to it. "I need you to hear what he told me yourself, because I don't think I'm capable of explaining it in a way that does justice to how insane it actually sounds."
I remember the drive to their house that evening with unusual clarity. The specific quality of anxious anticipation that comes from knowing you're about to have a conversation that will fundamentally change how you understand someone you love. I found myself at various points during that 25-minute drive, cycling through anger, confusion, and a strange, reluctant sympathy for whatever desperate circumstances might have led Blake to make a decision this serious, this genuinely dangerous, without ever once simply asking me directly whether there might be another way to address whatever.
I drove to Christine and Blake's house that same evening, and I want to describe that conversation carefully because it unfolded in a way that revealed considerably more about Blake's judgment and about the state of his marriage to my daughter than I'd initially anticipated.
Blake sat across from me at their kitchen table, visibly shaken, and explained, haltingly at first, the full sequence of events. The business's financial difficulties, the research into the old supplemental policy's cash value provision, the specific calculation that $11,000, combined with a payment he was expecting from a client he believed was finally about to settle a long-standing dispute, would allow him to cover a critical equipment lease payment that, if missed, would trigger a cascading default across several other financing agreements, potentially costing him the... I genuinely thought I could reinstate the coverage before it caused any real problem, he said, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine distress rather than simple defensiveness. I checked, and reinstatement typically processes within about 10 days if done quickly enough. I thought I had a window where the risk was minimal, and I was desperate enough about the business that I convinced myself it was a reasonable gamble. "Blake," I said, and I want to be honest that my voice was shaking. "I have a heart condition. I take medication daily that keeps that condition managed. During those 3 weeks, I had a cardiology appointment. If that appointment had fallen even a few days later, or if I'd needed an emergency refill of my medication, I could have been facing a $200 plus out-of-pocket cost I might not have been able to immediately afford. Or worse, I might have simply gone without medication I need to stay alive, all because you decided my health coverage was a reasonable thing to gamble with." I watched something collapse in his expression as I said this. The specific recognition, I think, of the actual stakes involved in a decision he'd apparently rationalized to himself as a manageable, temporary administrative maneuver, rather than what it actually represented, knowingly creating a gap in critical medical coverage for a person with a documented ongoing heart condition without that person's knowledge or consent, purely to access a relatively modest sum of cash. I want to tell you about the days that followed, because addressing the immediate practical crisis required considerable effort before any longer conversation about accountability could even properly begin. I contacted the insurance company again the following morning, this time with Christine present, and we worked through the process of reinstating my coverage, a process that, fortunately, given that the cancellation had been recent, and the reinstatement request came directly from me rather than through any disputed third-party authorization, moved relatively quickly. Christine insisted on driving over first thing that morning, sitting beside me at my own kitchen table while I made the call, her hand occasionally resting on my arm in a small, steadying gesture that I appreciated more than I think I fully expressed to her at the time. Full coverage was restored within 5 business days, though I want to be honest that those 5 days involved a level of anxiety about my own health management that I hadn't experienced since Patricia's final illness, carefully rationing my remaining medication, calling my cardiologist's office to explain the situation and confirm I had enough supply to safely bridge the gap. My cardiologist's office, once they understood the full situation, was genuinely helpful, arranging a small emergency supply through their own office samples to ensure I
wouldn't face any actual gap in my medication, regardless of how long the formal reinstatement process ultimately took.
I also contacted an attorney, a careful, methodical man named Foster Kimball, to understand exactly what legal recourse existed given what had happened. Foster explained that Blake's actions, while clearly a serious breach of trust, and arguably fitting the technical definition of unauthorized account access resulting in financial and potentially medical harm, existed in a somewhat complicated legal position, given that I had in fact originally granted him legitimate access to the portal, even though that access had clearly been used well beyond what I'd ever intended or authorized.
"You have options here, Leonard," Foster told me. "This could potentially be pursued as a form of financial elder abuse under state statute, given the combination of unauthorized action and the resulting risk to your health. Alternatively, we could focus on formally revoking and restructuring all account access going forward, treating this as a serious family matter to be resolved primarily through direct accountability rather than criminal or civil proceedings." Foster took considerable time during that meeting walking me through what each path would actually involve in practice, and I appreciated his willingness to lay out the genuine complexity of the decision, rather than simply steering me toward whichever option might generate more billable work for his office, a courtesy I've come to value considerably more since going through this entire ordeal. "Elder abuse statutes exist precisely for situations like this," he explained, "where someone in a position of trust uses that trust to create genuine risk to a vulnerable person's well-being, regardless of whether direct financial theft was the primary motivation. But I also want you to understand that pursuing this route would almost certainly mean a formal, permanent record, potential criminal exposure for Blake, and very likely an outcome from which your relationship with Christine, and by extension your grandchildren, may never fully recover. These aren't decisions I can make for you, but I want you making them with full clarity about what each path genuinely costs." I want to be honest about how difficult that decision felt, sitting in Foster's office, still processing the specific fear of those 5 days without confirmed coverage. Part of me, genuinely frightened by how close this situation had come to something considerably more dangerous, wanted to pursue the most serious possible consequences. Another part of me, thinking of Christine, of my grandchildren, of the marriage that Blake's decision had clearly put under considerable strain, wanted to find a path that addressed the seriousness of what happened without permanently fracturing my relationship with my daughter's family. I decided, ultimately, not to pursue formal elder abuse charges, though I made this decision carefully, rather than simply out of sentiment, understanding fully the seriousness of what I was choosing not to pursue. What I did instead was formalize, with Foster's help, an entirely restructured set of account protections, revoking all third-party access to my insurance and financial accounts immediately, establishing a clear, written protocol requiring my explicit, verified authorization for any future changes, and requiring, as a condition of my continued willingness to maintain a close. I want to tell you about the longer conversation Blake and I eventually had, about 3 weeks after the initial confrontation, because I think it revealed something important about both the depth of his financial desperation and the genuine remorse that emerged once the full weight of the risk he'd taken finally settled in. "I keep thinking about what you said," he told me, sitting again at that same kitchen table,
considerably more subdued than he'd been during our initial confrontation. About the medication, about what could have happened if timing had gone differently. I think I'd convinced myself, somewhere in my own panic about the business, that the risk was purely administrative, purely about paperwork and processing windows. And I never actually let myself sit with the fact that I was gambling with your actual physical health to solve a problem that was entirely mine to solve, not yours. I asked him directly whether the equipment lease crisis had ultimately been resolved, curious whether the underlying financial pressure that had driven this decision still existed. He explained that the client payment he'd been expecting had, in fact, come through about a week after our confrontation, resolving the immediate crisis independent of anything related to my insurance policy at all. A detail that struck both of us, I think, with a particular painful irony. The entire situation, the entire risk to my health, had ultimately proven unnecessary, even by Blake's own flawed calculation.
Since the business crisis resolved itself through legitimate means shortly afterward, regardless.
I remember sitting with that particular irony for several days afterward, unable to fully shake the specific bitterness of understanding that my medication coverage had been jeopardized for essentially nothing. That patience alone, had Blake simply waited the additional week rather than acting unilaterally, would have resolved his crisis without ever putting my health at any risk whatsoever. I mentioned this to Blake directly during a later conversation, and I watched him absorb the weight of that irony fully for what seemed like the first time, his voice barely above a whisper as he
Admitted. I know. I've thought about that more than almost anything else since this happened. I gambled with your life for a problem that would have solved itself if I'd just been patient enough to wait. I don't think I'll ever fully know whether hearing him articulate that specific recognition mattered more to my eventual willingness to move forward with our relationship than any of the more formal structural protections Foster and I put in place afterward.
I want to tell you about where things stand now, about 7 months after that afternoon at the pharmacy counter. Christine and Blake are, as far as I can tell, working through the strain this placed on their marriage with the help of a couples counselor, a process Christine described to me as necessary but genuinely difficult, addressing not just this specific incident, but a broader pattern of Blake making significant financial decisions unilaterally, without adequately consulting Christine, a pattern that predated and extended well beyond just what happened with my insurance. My relationship with Blake remains, I want to be honest, more cautious than it was before this happened. We see each other regularly at family gatherings, and our interactions are civil, even warm in certain respects. But I no longer extend the kind of unquestioning administrative trust I once did, and I don't think, honestly, that I ever fully will again. I've come to understand this as an appropriate boundary rather than lingering punishment, a recognition that some forms of trust, once demonstrated to be capable of such serious misuse, require considerably more careful, ongoing verification before they can be reasonably extended again in the same unguarded way. I've noticed over these 7 months small but genuine signs of Blake trying to actively rebuild that trust rather than simply waiting passively for time to resolve the tension between us. He calls occasionally now, not to ask for anything, simply to check in. Conversations that feel, in their own modest way, like a deliberate effort to demonstrate reliability through accumulated small moments, rather than any single grand gesture. Christine tells me he's also become considerably more transparent with her about the business's finances, sharing details and decisions he'd previously kept. Largely to himself.
a shift she describes as one of the more genuinely positive outcomes to emerge from an otherwise deeply painful several months for both of them. I think about that pharmacy counter often, about Deja's careful, concerned expression as she explained what the computer screen was showing her, about the specific vertigo of realizing that something as fundamental as my own healthcare access had been quietly altered without my knowledge by someone I'd trusted enough to grant meaningful access to my accounts in the first place. I think, too, about how differently this story could have ended had my cardiology appointment fallen even a few days later, or had some genuine medical emergency arisen during those 3 weeks of unknown coverage gaps. I've gone back to that pharmacy several times since, always making a point to thank Deja personally for the specific care she showed me that afternoon, ushering me away from the busy counter, refusing to let me simply absorb that shock while standing exposed in a line of waiting strangers. She told me, during one of those later visits, that she'd actually reported the incident, in a general, anonymized way, to her pharmacy's corporate office as an example of exactly the kind of situation that motivated their staff training around recognizing signs of elder financial exploitation. Something she mentioned almost sheepishly, clearly not wanting to make more of her own role than she felt was warranted. I told her, honestly, that her attentiveness that afternoon had likely been one of the more consequential moments of the entire ordeal. The specific difference between me discovering the gap through a routine, almost accidental interaction, and discovering it only during some genuine medical emergency, where the stakes would have been considerably higher. I've become, since all of this happened, considerably more deliberate about exactly what access I grant to anyone, family included. Understanding now that good intentions at the moment of granting that access don't necessarily predict how it might eventually be used, once circumstances and financial pressures shift in ways none of us can fully anticipate. I keep a detailed, updated log now of exactly what access exists for any of my accounts, reviewed formally with Foster every 6 months. A level of careful documentation that would have seemed excessive to me before all of this happened, and that now feels like simple, necessary prudence. I've also started, somewhat unexpectedly, sharing what happened with a small group of retired friends I meet with monthly, men roughly my own age who, like me, spent decades building the kind of stable careers that came with genuinely valuable retirement benefits, and who, I've discovered, share considerably more vulnerability around exactly this kind of situation than any of us had previously discussed openly with each other. Several of them, once I described what happened, admitted to having granted similarly broad account access to adult children or in-laws at various points, often during medical crises or simple convenience, without ever fully considering the scope of what that access actually permitted. We've since started a loose, informal practice of checking in with each other periodically about exactly this kind of account security, a small but meaningful community response to a vulnerability none of us had previously taken seriously enough, until my own situation made the stakes uncomfortably concrete. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever discovered that someone had made a significant decision about your own well-being without ever asking you directly, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened when Blake finally sat down with my grandchildren and explained, in age-appropriate terms, why Grandpa's insurance situation had become such a serious family conversation, that's a story too. Let me know. One last thought before I close this out. Foster told me something during our final review meeting that has stayed with me since. "Leonard," he said, "the cases that trouble me most in this line of work aren't usually the ones involving outright malice. They're the ones where someone convinces themselves that a genuinely dangerous shortcut is actually just a manageable administrative risk, because sitting with the full weight of what they're actually gambling with is simply too uncomfortable to face honestly. I think about that distinction often now, not just regarding Blake, but as a
Broader caution about how easily any of us, under enough pressure, might convince ourselves that a serious risk to someone else is actually just a temporary inconvenience, as long as we don't look at it too closely. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.